Hello and welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host Rafae Iqbal, and in today's show we'll be deliberating on two very important topics. The first being a rift between the United States and Europe over Ukraine. With regards to that, we know that Donald Trump, the United States president, escalated a jibe at the Ukrainian president, calling him a dictator. He blamed Ukraine for Russia's invasion in 2022, and as the United States and Russian officials have begun talks, they met in Saudi Arabia for a dialogue on resolving the Ukraine war, as earlier President Donald Trump had talked about how he will resolve this war in just a very little time. With regards to that, if we talk about this negotiation process, Ukraine and the European countries are excluded from this ongoing dialogue process. In the second segment, we'll be talking about Israel and how the Israeli military has been wreaking havoc in the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank as Arab leaders meet over Trump's Gaza plan. With regards to that, we also know that the US President Donald Trump, he announced that the US would take over the Gaza Strip and convert it into a Riviera of the Middle East. He further announced that Palestinians are to be relocated to neighboring countries, which of course the Arab countries have condemned. There are different countries in the Western world that have also condemned this, such as France, and it has been condemned all over the world. Pakistan has also condemned the statement by the US president, but we know with regards to the Israeli forces, they continue with the brutalities and atrocities that they have been committing in the Gaza Strip, with now a further increase that has been seen in the Jenin city and the Jenin refugee camp. And of course, when we talk about the ceasefire agreement, we know Hamas has been in conformity with all the clauses of the agreement. The prisoner exchanges are also taking place, but the Israeli army, it continues with its brutal offensive. After that, we'll be deliberating on two important news of the day as well. The first being how France's Senate has backed a move to ban headscarf in sports. In different sports. With regards to that, we know this has been a matter of controversy in France with regards to earlier case laws, as well as headscarf was banned in the school earlier, and there was legislation ongoing in France. But now there's a new move, as the France's Senate has backed a move to ban the headscarf in sports. In the second segment, with regards to the news that we have for the day, we'll be talking about the first ancient royal tomb that has been found in Egypt since the discovery of Tutankhamun's back in 1922. This marks almost more than 100 years since the discovery of an ancient tomb. Of course, a big development in archaeology and cultural heritage, as of course Egypt has found another royal tomb. We'll be deliberating on the first segment. We've been joined by Dr. Zafar Jaspal, who is an international affairs expert in the studios. And on Skype, we have been joined by Arnaud, who is a political consultant from Moscow. Thank you both for your time and being part of the conversation. I'll start off from Dr. Zafar Jaspal. So, when we talk about the US president's plans in Ukraine, how he talked about finishing off this war, resolving the conflict, of course, that plan, it was one that was being welcomed, but now, as it goes on, we see geopolitical tensions rising between the US and the European countries, of course, Ukraine as well. How do you comment on the progress of this plan of Donald Trump?
I think that this war is completing 3 years, day after tomorrow. And the American-led coalition, NATO members, and their other allies did their best to, you can say, defeat the Russia, but they miserably failed. According to the estimate, 120 billion US dollars have been spent, which were added in this by the American taxpayer money, and then 132 by the Europeans collectively. They have given this money to them. President Trump is very clear that how much he can spend, but we have not to forget that he is always a transactional leader, that who will be more focusing on his own First America policy. And within that, if you critically examine Trump's previous and this time, you would find that his primary focus is on the China. And he thinks that if this war ends, then his pivot to Asia, or you can say his Indo-Pacific strategy would be having a more strength. And then he will going to strengthen Quad or these kind of things. So what is the primary target is to break the alliances between Russia, North Korea, Russia, Iran, Russia, China. Of course, analysts have a consensus it's too difficult for Trump, but at the moment, who are suffering? Trump's policies, if you see from the very beginning, in the last 1 month, if we can critically examine his allies and neighbors, both are disturbed, both are in a complex situation. But now from his neighbors, he's more shifted on the European side, which you rightly pointed out in the intro. And in that context, you see what he made a statement, he straight away said, he deviated from the Americans' previous stance. He claimed that America didn't ask Ukraine to be a member of NATO, but it's factually incorrect. In Budapest, in Bucharest 2008, President Bush announced that the Ukraine, Georgia will be the member of the NATO. At that time, Europeans opposed it. They realized that it became difficult for us, and they were not interested to provoke the Russia. But now he's saying, no, we are not in this. But on the other side, what he started direct talks, bypassing the European, ignoring the Ukrainian leader. And when he started, then if you see, it's all the critical meeting between the Russians and the Americans. And what was the decision? Restoring full diplomatic relations. And Trump is, you can say, focusing on a 300 billion trade immediately, which will be restored with the Russia. So these kind of things. But there is another side. The biggest challenge for the European, where the peace which you identified, yes, peace will be there sooner or later, but how to endure the peace? There is a border, front line is 500 kilometer, and the border between Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, again you can say Russian client state, it's 2,000 kilometer. The estimate is that minimum you need 40,000 to 50,000 troops, and appropriate strength is required 200,000. Who will send? Europeans have just talked about like a paper tigers. They said that, for example, you can say France made an agreement, defense agreement with Ukraine. Britain made it, Poland made it, and they are only promising or talking about now training and weapons supply. They are not ready to send their troops. Even Macron, who was very much in favor of troop sending, but now when he realized that no one else is interested, France is also not interested.
Except the UK.
No, UK is not going to send the troops. So in this context, what is if the Americans are not bringing their troops in the Ukraine on the front line for enduring the peace after if there is a ceasefire, then how much? At least Europeans have to gather 50,000 troops, which the Europeans have no strength. They have to close all their other missions and change the NATO defense plan, and then they are able to, you can say, pull from those areas their troops and bring on the line of the Ukraine. Now that is not possible. So Europeans are fully confused, and if you see, Trump has now further increased the temperature when he said he is an illegal leader, dictator. So what is this? And secondly, the Vice President of US in Munich conference had also given an impression similar, and the same is their defense minister. So Europeans are, I think, in a big crisis at the moment.
Well, Dr. Zafar, I'd like to include comments from Mr. Arnaud Devela, as he's a political consultant from Moscow, with regards to the dialogue process that is commencing between the US and Russian officials. What's the sentiment that's coming from Moscow?
Well, the sentiment is pretty optimistic, cautiously optimistic to be sure, if one takes into account the repeated betrayals that one has witnessed during the Minsk Accords 1 and 2 and the stillborn Istanbul Accord. But everyone, at least every adult in the room, seems to be of the shared opinion that this conflict has got to come to an end. And one of the first things we should take into account in the wake of the Saudi Arabia meet a couple of days ago is that this was the first time in years that both Moscow and Washington actually engaged in any kind of format. Now, to be sure, the discussions mainly bore on setting a framework for cooperation on a range of issues, not just Ukraine, but a range of security issues, economic normalization, in other words. the Trump administration has been really clear, even during the campaign, that he wanted to end the war in Ukraine as soon as possible. And to the extent he might have finally gotten the right information from his security and intelligence sources, Donald Trump has finally realized that one of the main obstacles, first of all, is to somewhat resolve the Zelensky data in the equation. As your viewers might be interested in knowing, Zelensky should have been running, or at least holding elections last May of 2024, and invoked martial law to exempt himself from doing so. And so in so doing, basically, the constitution of Ukraine calls for the head of the parliament to take control of the government, which is not what has happened, unfortunately. Zelensky remains in charge, and to the extent he tied his own hands in October 2022 by issuing a decree forbidding any kind of negotiation with Russia in order to resolve the conflict, we find ourselves in a catch-22 situation here. So Donald Trump has basically called on Zelensky to organize elections as promptly as possible. And the least we can say thus far, and J.D. Vance and Steve Witkoff have been going on the airwave in the wake of Trump's statements bearing on the dictator status and the 4% rating, is that Zelensky has not been getting the cue, as any comedian should, and is now basically, it seems, the target of a media campaign, which is going to probably increase. But Zelensky's political survival is contingent on the war being pursued at all cost. He understands that, and one can bet that he receives reassurances not only from European capitals, but also from some figures of the famed US deep state, some of whom might have relocated to Europe and given him the guarantees that he needs in exchange for him to basically do whatever is required to sabotage any kind of peace talks. So this is where we stand right now. And we are, to be sure, witnessing a very interesting sequence.
Definitely. Dr. Zafar, coming to that and coming towards what you said in your previous answer with regards to President Donald Trump's policies of Make America Great Again. Of course, his policies are focused on that slogan which he raised in the campaigns. But when we talk about the policies having damage on America's relationships with their allies, such as the Transatlantic Alliance, how do you think that's going to impact it?
I think that the Americans have realized that they're too much this internationalist agenda is not serving them domestically. If you see that Trump won the popular vote and all the other kind of established institutions were not in favor. And in this context, America's own economy requires some kind of a readjustment. And where he talks about the tariffs, where he talks about the immigration, though they have a positive and negativity, but he won the election on that slogan and he's definitely going. And the most important thing in this context is his famous slogan, I will stop the war, I will strengthen the defense of the US. But there's another important thing is that I just came across last Thursday, what he said, that he's going to meet the President Putin and President Xi. And in his first meetings, what he's going to propose them that why not we can cut 50% our defense budgets. And at the same time, before that, in order to address his own strategic community, he proposed iron domes. Though missile iron dome is a missile shield which is only effective against the rockets or small range missiles, not against the cruise or hypersonic or what you call it ICBMs. But at the same time, if you recall, in 2018, he raised the Space Command and he referred about the space interceptors. So if he is expanding the scope of the Iron Dome, bringing it or interceptors in the space, on the one side he's talking about the space weaponization with the new technologies, definitely required a more budget. And on the other side, he's talking, or basically wanted to get rid of the continuous expenditure which in the last 3 years they faced in the Ukraine. Ukraine is becoming a dead for them issue. And if in this context, if you see the Russians gathered support from the technologically or small arms, in that case from the Iran, and also troops from the North Korea.
Yeah.
So in the Ukraine, only Ukrainians are fighting. No European soldier has entered in the theater, nor Americans are prepared for it. So where the war will go? So of course Trump, as an intelligent leader, thinks that it's better I can get a credit of stopping this war instead of wasting more resources and money. What the Americans wants to achieve, in the first line they achieved the NATOization of the Europe, which they did. But how much he is trusting? If you see his previous administration, even at that time he was very much skeptical about the NATO members and their spending in the NATO affairs, and this time again. So in this context, I think when he talked about to make America's big or a great, I think he's more focusing on the basic, what is the America, why America is preeminent, though military muscle is there, but technological advancement, educational proficiencies and other things. I think he's learning from the Chinese that if your economy is rising and you are able to invest more and attract more, maybe he's following that model. Or second could be, by stopping these wars, he wanted to you can say focus on the China, but again his indications are entirely different. He talked about 60% tariff, but he only levied 10%. So it's what you call it, it's unpredictable situation.
Yeah.
But one trend is very clear, that Ukrainian war's burden will be on Ukrainians and on the Europeans, and the Europeans have to revisit their defense policy and establish their defense forces. If you recall, in the 90s, the Europeans talked about Eurocorps, but they failed. They failed in the Yugoslavia case, they failed in the Kosovo case, and again they relied on NATO. But at that time Americans were supportive to that. NATO, you can see significance, and they need the NATO in the war on terror.
Yes.
But at this stage, let's see, Americans don't need the NATO at the moment, Europeans need the more.
Yeah.
But of course, NATO is a big earning force indirectly for the Americans and for their preeminence in the international politics.
And of course, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Mr. Arnaud Devela, I'd like your comments as well with regards to what, when we talk about the European countries, when we talk about this alliance that had been going on for so long, how do you see its relationship with Russia going on in the days to come?
Well, I think Europe has to understand that the days of American umbrella are over. Donald Trump essentially wants to pull US troops out of Europe to redirect them probably elsewhere. But to be sure, Donald Trump is facing a country on the verge of bankruptcy. He needs to revamp completely all those imperial policies. And he understands that if the Europeans from now on want to be politically viable as an entity, as a player on the international stage, they're going to have to assume the cost of assuming their own defenses. If Europe manages to get rid of some of the most incompetent class of politicians that we've seen in generations, they're going to have to include Russia into a pan-European security architecture, which would go from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Only by including Russia and taking into account Russia's security concern will the situation be resolved for the best. But this idea of confronting Russia at all costs on the basic premises that it represents a kind of a relic, since Europe considers itself a post-national construct, is not going to lead them anywhere. And J.D. Vance's speech in Munich was an attempt to remind them that they've completely turned their back on what defined them, which was free speech, democracy, and an attachment to traditional values, among other things. So we'll see what happens. There are elections in Germany this weekend. This could be a watershed moment, but Europe has to basically engage in introspection phase now.
Well, definitely, Mr. Arnaud Devela, political consultant from Moscow, thank you for your time and your valuable insights. Of course, they're very much appreciated. Of course, interesting times to come as we see Donald Trump with his new policies and, of course, the Make America Great Again policy, how it's impacting the geopolitical situation and how it's affecting America's relationship with its allies that have, of course, stood for very long, and, of course, the transatlantic alliance as well. how it is getting out of America's umbrella, as Mr. Devela just quoted. With that, we'll move towards the second segment. Of course, it also deliberates on Donald Trump's policies with regards to the Middle East and the Gaza Strip. We know that Donald Trump has announced plans for the U.S. to take over the Gaza Strip and, of course, convert it into a Riviera of the Middle East. This statement has been condemned by different quarters of the world. The Arab countries and even the Western countries such as France have condemned it. Pakistan's Foreign Office has condemned it. And all those who believe in the two-state solution have done so and termed it as ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, displacing them from their own land and shifting them to neighboring countries. Something with the ceasefire agreement in effect, this statement comes as very disappointing for all the Muslims around the world. And as Hamas as also as in conformity with the ceasefire agreement, the prisoner exchanges are taking place, and of course still we see the Israeli army wreaking havoc in the Gaza Strip, particularly in Jenin, how there's massive attacks that are taking place in the Jenin refugee camp. There's also talk of the WHO director who was kidnapped earlier, and how these Israeli attacks and Israeli brutalities are further creating tensions in the Middle East and plunging the region into further chaos and confusion. With regards to that, we know that there's a lot of talk being done regarding Israeli atrocities. There's a lot of talk and a lot of protest being done against this US Donald Trump statement, but this still continues. With regards to that, we've been joined by Dr. Sundus Mustaqeem in the studios, who is a foreign affairs analyst. Along with that, on Skype, we've been joined by Osama Nazzal, Palestinian journalist from Jenin. Thank you both for your time and being part of the conversation. I'll start off from Dr. Sundus. With regards to when we talk about the Gaza Strip and, of course, how the ceasefire agreement had been in place, how Hamas had been in conformity with all the clauses of the ceasefire agreement. But we saw a statement from the US president with regards to the Gaza Strip, turning it into a Riviera of the Middle East. Of course, all quarters have termed it very unsentimental by the US president. How do you comment on that with regards to the ceasefire agreement in place and how the US was one of the key players who got that ceasefire to come into effect along with Qatar?
Well, we were very happy about the ceasefire thing, but it didn't happen as we thought it would. It is supposed to be, because only Arab world and all the Muslim world is actually happy with the ceasefire thing. But the latest Trump statement, the bold vision of Trump with Netanyahu is extremely different and extremely opposite to what we thought it is supposed to be. And as we know that Trump is having this background in the real estate, so the reconstruction of his Gaza's plan is as horrifying, as dangerous as it should not be, actually. So the reconstruction of Gaza plan actually is rebuilding Gaza and reconstructing Gaza. So we are so glad that the Arab world and the Saudi Arabia in particular is taking a lead, as recently MBS just has said that the whole international community is responsible to uphold all the international peace and stability in the Gaza Strip. It's a very densely populated area, and we are, according to MBS, we should show our concern both for Lebanon and for Gaza as well. So the reconstruction plan, Trump's reconstruction plan and his bold vision is actually horrifying, and that's why the summit is going on, and that's why all the Arab world is now on one page, luckily, and that's what we are supporting. So let's strongly wish and pray that there would be any I would say the middle area, the balanced approach, because they are not accepting Hamas. They cannot afford to see Hamas in the Gaza Strip, because if Hamas will take charge military-wise or politically, so actually they want a puppet government like they had in Afghanistan when they were when US was in Afghanistan. So they want that puppet government in the Gaza as well, but they cannot afford to see Hamas in Gaza Strip, both military wise and politically. So they can since if and Hamas is over there to do any type of sacrifice or compromise, they want complete Israel withdrawal from the Gaza. So
but even then, Hamas is in conformity with the ceasefire agreement, and Israel is the one that is violating it.
They want to release all the hostages. They want to release. They want to do every type of sacrifice and compromise in order to secure the Gaza place.
Definitely, Dr. Sundus very well pointed out. I'd like to include comments from Osama Mohammed Nazzal as well. He's a Palestinian journalist from Jenin. So, we know, thank you for your time, first of all, being part of the conversation. Secondly, we know when we talk about the Gaza Strip and when we talk about the ceasefire agreement, we know Israeli army has increased attacks, particularly in the Jenin city. We know that the Arab leaders are to meet tomorrow in Saudi Arabia. Of course, the ceasefire agreement was something that was very well celebrated when it took effect, when it was reached. But now when we see the developments, how Israel is still violating that ceasefire agreement and has further increased its attacks in the Jenin area, how do you comment on the summit and Israel's action so far, and how there needs to be further accountability?
Yes, since Israel agreed to the ceasefire deal in Gaza, it killed over 27 Palestinians in Gaza itself. And this is a blatant violation of the ceasefire deal itself. Once also it signed the deal, the ceasefire deal, it moved its forces from Gaza to the West Bank. And just yesterday, the Israeli special forces killed 3 Palestinian young men in the refugee camp of Al-Far'a here in the north of the West Bank. And Israel has a comprehensive plan when it comes to the West Bank, which is to undermine the rule and the sovereignty of the Palestinian Authority and to take over more Palestinian land for colonial purposes and for increasing the number of its settlers in the West Bank. And it is known that Israel does not recognize and does not name the West Bank West Bank. They call it Judah and Samaria, and this is the Torah or the biblical name that they use, showing how much Israel is against any right of the Palestinian people, especially the right of self-determination. The Palestinians in Gaza were waiting for just a pack of tomatoes or any kind of food through Rafae crossing, and this did not happen because Israel did not want that to happen. So I don't want to be pessimistic about the results of the upcoming Arab Summit, because it's clear that Israel threatens not only the people of Palestine, but also it threatens the geography and the people of Egypt and Jordan. And we saw how Netanyahu, supported by the American President Trump, threatens to take the Palestinians out to Egypt and Jordan. And he called for having a Palestinian state on the land of the Saudi Arabia. I think that the Arab governments and the Arab peoples now feel the threat that Israel poses to them. And so we hope that the outcomes of this Arab summit are going to be different from the outcomes of the previous summits.
Definitely, we hope that as well, and all hope towards ending the suffering of the Palestinian people and an end to the brutal Israeli atrocities that they are committing. Dr. Sundus, when we talk about concerted efforts being put in, it's not the first time that the Arab League has discussed Israeli brutalities in the Gaza Strip. It's not the first time that there's international voices raised against Israeli brutalities. South Africa took Israeli actions to the ICJ as well. We also know that the International Criminal Court and the ICJ also took action against that, but it didn't yield any positive results for what the majority of the world was wanting at that time. With regards to this Arab Summit, do you think a more concerted effort needs to be put in with all the like-minded countries? We know that even in the European countries, there were countries that called out called out Israel for their brutalities, and they even stopped diplomatic ties with them. Do you think a more unified approach needs to be taken, and there needs to be other organizations like the OIC that also comes into effect, and a joint framework be established to curb Israel's atrocities?
I think the coming summit is itself a very positive gesture. This is conveying a very strong impression to the whole world that the Muslim countries are finally on one page, and this conveys a very strong message to the international community that we are not scattered or we are not shattered and we are on one page. So I think we should stay hopeful with this upcoming summit, and we should not say any negative things about this, that this is not going to be successful. The commencement of the summit itself is a very positive gesture, I believe, right? So finally and luckily, after this 1-8 raid, we have seen many horrible scenes that they had, like even snipers, or they had tracks even on the hospitals and the kids and all that stuff. So after that horrible 1 year, the summit, that the old Muslim Valorant page itself is a very positive gesture. And as far as the reconstruction thing is concerned, so I think 55 billion, according to the UNESCO report, needs to be done in the next 1 year. They need like 53 around billion US dollars in order to reconstruct the whole Gaza densely populated strip. But still, the ceasefire is not as it was supposed to be. I just said Israel is still having the attacks on the refugees camp, and it's still bombarding and all that stuff. So in this scenario, when they're not fulfilling all the points of the ceasefire, but Hamas is doing, actually Hamas is fulfilling the points, Hamas is sacrificing, compromising, as I said, but not Israel is not doing. As recently he met with Benjamin Netanyahu, he's met with the US top diplomat, America, and they said they talk about on this bold vision on the reconstruction. And once again, Israeli PM has given this bold statement that US president is again one of the strongest ally. He used to give the same statement about the Joe Biden. Now he's saying in the White House, Trump is the bestest friend ever for the. So he's keep on giving such remarks about the US presidents. So in this scenario, when US and we see the US and Israel strong as in strongest ally. So I think this is the commencement of this summit itself is a very positive gesture and is conveying very strong image to the international community.
But Dr. Sundus, do you think when we talk about Israeli atrocities and the Israeli actions, there's been voices from all over the world with regards to Israel not having any respect or regard for international law or norms. Do you think them violating the ceasefire agreement should be taken to court?
But there would be of no use. We all know that. I mean, but again, I'd say that when we try something, when we struggle something, or even we talk about something on social media and in our programs, it does matter. It is enough to convey certain message, though we know it would be successful or not. But talking about such stuff, combining all Arab world together is a self-conveying very strong message. I think we should continue conveying such messages to international community that we are standing with our Palestinian brothers and sisters.
Well, definitely diplomatic and moral efforts are always with the Palestinians. With regards, I'd like comments from Osama as well. As you being a Palestinian, you being in Jenin City, of course, I'd like you to highlight how there's the increased attacks in Jenin City. And secondly, you being a Palestinian, what are your sentiments towards the Donald Trump's statements with regards to converting the Gaza Strip into a Riviera of the Middle East, and secondly, relocating the Palestinians to neighboring Arab countries?
Concerning the situation in Jenin City and the north of the West Bank in general, as the situation in Tul Karim and in Tubas is not different. Israeli occupation military campaign is going on, destroying more of the Palestinian infrastructure, dismissing or displacing over 22,000 Palestinian residents from the Jenin refugee camp and the nearby neighborhoods. The people have been living for over 28 days without electricity, without the necessary basic human needs for the everyday life. The Palestinian people can't take to the streets for shopping, for going to schools, for practicing their everyday life because of the danger posed by the Israeli occupation forces, who are heavily armed and ready to kill without any reason or any justification but for the purpose of killing. That is the situation in Jenin and Northwest Bank. Concerning the American president, we were not surprised, and his statements were expected because he is the one during his first term announced the holy city of Jerusalem and the first Qibla of all the Muslim world as the eternal capital of the Israeli Zionist regime. At the same time, he is the orchestrator or the architect of the ultimate deal or the deal of the century, which gives Israel all of Palestine and excluding the rights of the Palestinians. And I think if he doesn't find real resistance from the Arabic and Islamic world to thwart his plan of Rivera and expulsion of Gaza people, he is going to implement it. And the ground is fertile for that, as Israel is besieging Gaza. Gaza is fully destroyed. Humanitarian access is very little, and Israel can stop it anytime it decides to do so. So we need a real tangible support from our brothers in the Arab and Islamic world and from all the people who support justice and human rights to stop Netanyahu Trump's plan. Concerning the solution, the only way out of this ordeal and this long lasting crisis is the end of the Israeli occupation. And the Palestinians offered much for that. You know that the people who live in Jenin refugee camp and face the Israeli crimes today are the grandchildren of the people who were expelled from Haifa, Jaffa, Safad, Akka in 1948. Despite that, the Palestinians accepted to say that Israel can exist as a state on these areas. And just the Palestinians accepted the 22% of historic Palestine according to the PLO program and Oslo Accord. And Israel still rejects that.
Dr. Sundus, what Israel is doing in Palestine and what India is doing in occupied Jammu and Kashmir, when we talk about the models that they're following, it's of a very similar nature. Both of them have been called open-air prisons of the world. But still, we see that despite the world community calling it ethnic cleansing, despite the world community calling it genocide, there's not a framework that stops such acts of ethnic cleansing or genocide. Do you think there needs to be more work to stop such acts in the first place, and so that there could be a framework to hold those who pursue such acts be held accountable?
Unfortunately, there are two different worlds. Not the whole world thinks the same as you're talking about. The other part of the world since think that the US and the Israel has their command and can secure the Gaza territory, as India mistakenly thought that they can secure Kashmir. So unfortunately, there are two types of the world. So we live in the first part of the world, those who think that it's open prison. So these are the horrible, I would say, the clash of ideas. You know, and that's why we always say we cannot counter terrorism because your freedom fighter might be my terrorist and my terrorist can be your freedom fighter. That's what is happening over here. The freedom fighters of Kashmir and the freedom fighter of the Palestinians are the same because they are fighting for their freedom. But the monopoly of Indian monopoly and the US monopoly and the Israeli monopoly is a thought they can easily secure through ethnic cleansing or by displacing people or reconstructing someone's land by snatching, by adopting, by replacing people. So isn't that easy to replace someone? Isn't that easy to reconstruct someone else's land just you want to secure your oil? Maybe you have your hidden agendas because the thing it's a good place for oil, because the thing, you know, gone are the days when these Jews and Christians had this rivalry, but when it comes to oil, when it comes to gold, when it comes to Kashmir land, they forget everything, you know. So that's why there is we live unfortunately in the bipolar world where there is an extremism in one part and extremism in another part. So if things will continue go on in the same way, there would be no solution. You know, there will be war after war and war after war. Policies will remain on the paper, and on the field we can only see the war, the fights and all that stuff. So ceasefire doesn't work like this. You know, when Hamas is ready to do so, the one party is ready to do the ceasefire, when one party is dying to do whatever is required to do in order to stop this war and all that stuff. But the first party, the first US and and the Israel, they don't want to do that. You know, they are not even taking Hamas seriously. They still think in their dictionary Hamas is a terrorist organization. So how can we expect them to listen to this terrorist organization? You know, this is in the top 1 dictionary in the index. This is the top 4 terrorist organization. That's why they are not on one page. You know, conversation and communication and conflict resolution starts with the communication when the both parties think that they are with the equal standing. So when one party thinks that the other party is a terrorist group, and why should we listen to this terrorist party? So things can go in a very horrible way, and
Definitely.
I don't think so there would be any peaceful resolution. We can only wish and pray, but again, hope is not a strategy. So let's see.
Well, definitely important points raised. Mr. Osama, I'd like to come towards you. When we talk about Jenin and the situation on ground and Hamas, of course, Hamas has been in conformity with all the clauses, all the statements made in the ceasefire agreement. There's also prisoner exchanges taking place as they were supposed to and as they were arranged. Still, we see on the Israeli side, their military continues with their brutal offensive. And of course, hope is not a strategy, as Dr. Sundus also said. How do you think a more effective resolution to the conflict can be made with regards to more media highlighting what is going on the ground realities in Jenin, in the occupied West Bank, even after the ceasefire agreement? Because what the statements are coming from the US, they're like, it's all going to be good once the US comes in to save the place.
With regard to the media question, I think that the Arab and Muslim world need to build a strong media front in order to face the propaganda that is published through the Israeli media and promoted by many of the Western media as they try to demonize and tarnish the image of the Palestinian people at the start of the war, and they present Israel to the world as the victim being victimized by the Palestinian brutes. That's what the American media, the British media, and many Western media outlets worked on that. So we need a media institution, we need media institutions, we need a media front in order to refute this false narrative and let the world see the fact that Israel has been murdering Palestinian children, Palestinian citizens since its occupation of the Palestinian territories. The fact that the Palestinian people offered unprecedented concessions, as I mentioned before, accepting only 22% of historic Palestine for Palestinian statehood and accepting just a fraction of Jerusalem, which is the eastern part of the city, to be the capital of that state. Israel rejected all that. Israel rejects and turns its back to more than 750 resolutions issued by the United Nations General Assembly and other United Nations bodies, including the Security Council, to solve this conflict. And instead of having a pressure on Israel to implement at least one of these resolutions, we see how the American administration provides Israel with the mother of the bombs, with F-35 planes, and also helping Israel to drive the Palestinian people out, not only from Gaza, but also from the West Bank, because the situation here is really terrific and traumatic all the time. So without having one word that all the Muslims speak in one tongue, hand in hand, and pressure the international community, the United States, the European Union, the UK, to force Israel to end its occupation, I think this conflict would continue, would be perpetuated, and the Palestinian people would continue to suffer, but not alone, as we see that the whole region...
Unity is the way forward and a unified approach is the way forward. Osama Mohammed Nazzal, Palestinian journalist from Jenin, thank you for your time and being part of the conversation. Your views are highly appreciated. And of course, I'd like to also thank Dr. Sundus Mustaqeem, a foreign affairs analyst who had joined us in the studios. Thank you for your time and being part of the conversation, as well as we were talking about how the Israeli forces are currently wreaking havoc in the West Bank, despite the ceasefire agreement being in place, and how the US President Donald Trump had also announced to convert the war-torn Gaza Strip into a Riviera of the Middle East. Of course, we heard both of our panelists how they condemned it, as the world powers have also. Now we're moving towards the top news that we have for today. The first one being France's Senate backing the move to ban headscarf in sports. With regards to that, France's right-wing dominated Senate has backed a bill to ban religious symbols, including the hijab, in all sports competitions, professional and amateur, sparking accusations of discrimination from the left and right advocates. The bill still needs a majority of votes from the lower house and National Assembly to become law, but the right-leaning government has thrown its weight behind the measure. Critics see the headscarf worn by some Muslim women as a symbol of creeping Islamization, as this is something that has been prolonged in France with regards to earlier legislation as well, with regards to the ban in school on the headscarf. In the second news that we have for today, we'll be talking about Egypt, how it has announced the discovery of Pharaoh's tomb in more than 100 years. A joint Egyptian-British mission has identified an ancient tomb near Luxor as that of King Thutmose II, marking the first discovery of a pharaohic royal tomb in more than 100 years, Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities said on Tuesday. Located west of the Valley of Kings, Thutmose II's tomb was the last tomb of the kings of Egypt's 18th dynasty and the first royal tomb discovered since King Tutankhamun's in 1922. Archaeologists were able to identify the tomb due to alabaster vessels found on site and inscribed with the name of King Thutmose II and his wife, Queen Hatshepsut, one of a small handful of women to have ruled Egypt. Well, with that, we wrap up Newsroom for today. We discussed both of our topics in detail, and we also gave you the two latest and top news that we had for today. See you same time tomorrow. Till then, take care.